In 1967, Egypt, allied with Syria and heavily armed by the Soviets, moved its forces close to Israel's border and closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping. But Israel launched a massive preemptive airstrike which decimated the Egyptian and Syrian forces. Armed with the latest American and French weapons, Israel forced the Egyptians to retreat and completely overran the West Bank, setting themselves up in occupation over all of Greater Israel, including Jerusalem. Thus, the Zionist dream of dominion over all of the ancient Jewish kingdoms seemed to be fulfilled.
Well, when we look at the 1967 war, we have so many different issues here, and the reality is quite different in many ways from what has been presented. There's no question that Nasser went into the Sinai, and that ultimately, rather quickly, the UN people were forced to leave, and this included from Sharm el-Sheikh. And at this point, the Israeli army was mobilized, including all the reservists, and this can hurt the economy over a period of a couple of weeks, obviously, and it's a crisis situation. And there's also no question that Egyptian propaganda was talking about throwing the Jews into the sea, avenging the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that propaganda was being beamed into Israel. And Israelis were horrified and saw this as a major threat, obviously, to their security. On the other hand, Nasser, once he went into Sharm el-Sheikh, didn't blockade, you say. He was aware of what had gone on in '57 when Golda Meir and the UN had said, this will be a casus belli. And then he's mocked, not only by the Syrians, you see, his major Arab nationalist rivals, but also by Hussein of Jordan, who hates Syria. They're both calling him a coward for not blockading, you see, the Straits of Tiran and closing off the Gulf of Aqaba. And there's a whole propaganda war going on between these Arab states that are the three Arab states that are going to be involved in the 1967 war. It's a crazy situation. Now, once he does that, of course, you technically have a justification for Israel to attack, but Israel doesn't. The United States has gotten involved, and there's a lot of effort to try and build up international support to open things up. And as this goes on, and there's major consultation between the Israelis and Washington, the Lyndon Johnson administration, Israelis keep coming in, and what happens is they ultimately get reassurances behind the scenes that we will not object if they attack. There is a crisis in Israel because Eshkol is seen as very weak, and had been seen as weak before. And so he had brought Moshe Dayan back in, the hero of the Sinai campaign in '56, as his Minister of Defense, and then he allowed Menachem Begin in as Minister without portfolio, the revisionist leader, whom Ben-Gurion had despised. Ben-Gurion's now out of politics. And this is a major victory for the revisionists, this legitimacy that they have. But even then, the votes are tied, and Eshkol is hesitating, and there apparently is almost a military revolt at one point, because they want to attack. You see, regardless of what the Israeli public understandably thought in terms of all these threats and what had been going on, the Israeli military saw this as a great opportunity, because they knew they could beat all three armies. And the CIA told them, yeah, you can do this, there's no problem. So, and they wanted to defeat and destroy the armies and wreck all their armor, all Soviet supplied armor in the case of the Soviets, the Syrians and the Egyptians. So the military was champing at the bit, and Eshkol was holding back. And there were some terrible meetings that went on, which the public at that time did not know about. Well, in the meantime, an American businessman who was operating for the Americans had talked to Nasser. And a deal was made for an Egyptian vice president, Zakaria Mohieddin, to come to Washington on the 7th of June to talk about a withdrawal. In other words, things would be diffused. And it was hard to claim that the Egyptians, although they had violated this whole thing about the Sharm el-Sheikh and blockade, that they were really intending to attack, because it did not really seem that their troops were in offensive positions ready to go. As a matter of fact, when the Israelis finally attacked on June 5th, they were all stood down. There was nothing really going on. The deal to have this Egyptian come was June 2nd. The Israelis were informed on June 3rd, and the advance delegation for the Egyptians was arriving June 5th. Now, as I said, Israel had a justification to attack, but they had hesitated, but their decision to attack was made after they learned that the Egyptians were coming. In other words, it was not because they were afraid of an imminent Egyptian attack. It was because they were afraid and feared that the Egyptians would get away with something, creating a crisis and withdraw, and the Israelis would not have done anything about it because of this deal that would be made. And that really is what caused them to attack, to make the decision to attack. And this stuff is still getting misrepresented. There's a major volume out, The Foreign Relations of the United States, on the 1967 war. The State Department just put it out, which gives you all the details. But a man named Richard Haas, who was in the Clinton administration, just had an article in Foreign Policy trying to show that he is an alternative to the Bush administration, still supports regime change. But he uses the 67 war in some ways and says, Israel attacked because of an imminent danger from Egypt. Totally false. Had there been a danger at the end of May, could you say that this was? Absolutely. But when you finally decided to attack, you knew that the Egyptians were looking for a way out. And of course, it was a debacle. And the Jordanians had stupidly taken Egyptian leadership. They had allowed an Egyptian to come in. The deployments have been changed. They fought very well. I talked to some Israelis who fought in that war, and they admired them and the way the Syrians fought when you took the Golan Heights. But there was a tremendous amount of effort on all sides then. The Israelis just swept through. They were able to take Jerusalem, which they then annexed to Israel, and the West Bank. And then later on, they took the Golan Heights. And of course, the West Bank and the Golan are still Israeli today. The Sinai was returned as a result of the 73 war and then negotiations that occurred at that time following that. Now, the 67 war had a tremendous impact in many, many ways. It's not just territory. It devastated Nasser. He lived on to 1970, but his reputation had declined. And he had been a hero of Arab nationalism, and the Egyptians had idolized him. And in Egypt, this is going to cause the beginning of a shift towards Islam, towards religion, because socialism has proved bankrupt, and the Egyptian state economy is a joke under Nasser. And what do we have? And we've been destroyed, our army. The Israelis are on the Suez Canal, you see what I mean? And the canal, by the way, will be blocked for 8 years, until 75. Which the United States doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because we're in Vietnam, and this means that Russian supplies through the Black Sea can't go through the Suez Canal. They got to go all the way around Africa. So that's fine. Leave this canal closed. Not only is religion going to be very important there, but when Anwar Sadat succeeds Nasser, he's very fearful of the left-wingers who were allied with Nasser. So he begins to encourage the Muslim Brotherhood to become more public, to gain Islamic sentiment backing him against his leftist enemies, you see. So Islam then is going to become more of an issue in Egyptian politics. At the same time, in Israel, it's not strictly religious, but the fact you've taken over what had been part of ancient Israel means that even many secular Israelis see this in a historic way, and want to settle there. This doesn't happen all at once. But there is this beginning of a movement that then becomes much more mobilized with Gush Ebanim, 1973-74, and illegal settlements being allowed. You turn a blind eye and they can be set up and all this sort of thing. In the meantime, the Israelis had promised that they would negotiate and withdraw for nearly all the territory. But they informed the United States after the war that that wasn't necessarily going to be the case. On the other hand, their stand was that the Arabs would have to negotiate with them directly, not through the UN. And a great deal of what is going to go on in the early 70s is going to have to do with the UN and certain politicians in the Nixon administration, the Secretary of State, pushing for international involvement, William Rogers, whereas Kissinger and Nixon are sabotaging the UN and letting Israel know through the back door they don't have to worry about it. And Israel is in the Sinai, and they begin to build air bases there and things like that. They immediately begin to settle in the Golan Heights. And a man who does that is a man named Yigal Allon, who was seen as a moderate, but he was elected from northern Israel, and a lot of his constituency want to settle on the Golan Heights. This is democracy at work, you see. So the West Bank is the trickiest issue, and what are you going to do about that? Gradually, but slowly, but gradually, you're going to begin to have settlements there, even under Yitzhak Rabin when he's prime minister in the mid-70s, and then once Begin comes in, it's going to explode from 77 onwards. So we're looking at this, and how are you going to resolve this situation where Israel is in control of these territories? Sadat comes in, and Sadat really wants to settle things. He makes all sorts of overtures where he wants full return of the Sinai in return for peace, which the Israelis don't really want. They want to control some of the Sinai. The Israelis finally decide that if they can get a deal with Egypt, that would help, because then they could isolate Egypt and deal with the Jordanians and the Syrians without worrying about the Egyptians, who have the biggest army. It's not to settle things and make peace, it's to have more control over those areas. But in the meantime, things are developing where Saddam and the Egyptians have thought, and Assad is in part of Syria, they've been pleading with the United States, look, we want to get something going here. And the key here was Security Council Resolution 242, which was very ambiguous, because it said that all nations should be able to live in peace and secure boundaries. It also said that no country should be able to keep territory acquired by war, you see. And it said that Israel should withdraw from territories taken in the recent conflict. Now, the word "the" was left out before "the territory." So Israel was not required to withdraw from the territories, just territories. Israel said it would not agree to UN Security Council Resolution 242 if "the" was in there, although it's in the French and Russian versions, because that would mean all the territories. They wanted to keep some territory. Why? Because other parts of 242 said all countries can live in secure and recognized boundaries, and we can't be secure in what we had, so we're going to have to keep some more territory. See what I mean? So we'll have to keep some. Now, what occurs here, again, domestic politics come in. From the beginning of 73, Egypt and Syria are preparing for an attack at some point, if the Nixon administration isn't going to get involved. Domestic politics, Nixon has Watergate. He's not paying any attention. Kissinger is running the country. The U.S. isn't going to do anything, even though the Egyptians in 72 threw out the Soviets, which the Americans wanted as a Cold War victory. Okay, so nothing's going to happen on that front. You prepare for this, you say. Would you have attacked? Who knows? But you have an election coming up in Israel. And Moshe Dayan is this very mercurial person who's been part of the labor coalition. And he says to Golda Meir, I'm going to go over to the opposition unless you agree that there's something in our platform that says we are going to keep almost half the Sinai Peninsula, we're going to annex it, as well as begin really pushing settlements in the West Bank. And if you can envision this in terms of the Sinai, what you'd have to do with a map, you come down from the northeast corner of the Sinai and Gaza and come down to the middle central area and then come over. So you're taking the eastern part all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, Sharm el-Sheikh, and the bottom of the Sinai, and then you come over to half of the western part. And the reason you're doing that is that the Egyptians had discovered oil there and have been using it, and the Israelis have been taking that oil illegally, contrary to conventions, but they want to annex that too. So this becomes part of the Labour Party platform, which an Israeli politician at the time, Pinhas Sapir, says, this is stupid. This is domestic politics, but this should have nothing to do with this. What would be next, you say? So you have the attack, which is a major victory initially. The Syrians almost regained all of the Golan Heights, not quite. The Israelis fought back valiantly and successfully and finally held them off. The Egyptians stormed across the canal, which Dayan had been saying in the election campaign in the fall of 73, we have the superiority for the next 10 years, the Arabs can't do anything. This shattered his career. Even though finally the Israelis win and they finally wind up coming over on the western side of the canal, they're in territorial Egypt, this is going to be settled. There's serious fighting, and I have Israeli friends who are fighting in Suez, and they admired the Egyptians. The Egyptians really fought well in this war. They avenged 67, even though they didn't win outright. The Israelis wanted to drive the Egyptians out of the Sinai Peninsula and put the status quo back in before the attack. But the Americans intervened and said, no, this is a negotiating chance. You see, the Israelis didn't like it. But then Henry Kissinger becomes the star, and he does his shuttle diplomacy when he's not going out with movie stars in Hollywood. And you have these disengagements that are beginning to take place. 2 with Egypt, 74, 75, and 1 with Syria on the Golan Line in 74. And this is what was called a step-by-step process, whereby the idea is that you are ultimately going to create trust. They're called confidence-building measures. No confidence was ever built with these. This was a fiasco. But it was this idea of incremental steps that ultimately lead to negotiations. Well, after the second Egyptian-Israeli deal, Assad is furious in Syria because he wasn't consulted. And it's clear to everybody that Sadat wants a private deal. He's sick of Egyptian blood being spilled. He wants the Americans to come in. And if he agrees to peace with Israel, and he's already been opening up the economy, you see, to foreign investment to try and get the U.S. on his side, he thinks he can have a separate peace and his economy will develop. So he lets the Israelis know, to everyone's astonishment, that he's willing to go to Jerusalem, etc. And you begin to have negotiations, although it takes a very long time for them to get off the ground. The Israelis are very eager to have this because, as I've said before, they don't want peace in the entire Middle East. They want to be able to impose their will vis-a-vis the West Bank, Jordan, and Syria. And if you can get Egypt out of the way, great. See, you don't have to worry about that flank. And ultimately, after much conflict, Sadat and Begin, who by this time despise each other, with their advisors, come to Camp David in 1978, and at the last gasp minute, make an agreement that translates into the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of March of 79 and the exchange of ambassadors, etc. And the Israelis agreed that they will withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula in 3 stages, the last one being in April of 82, and I was in Israel when that happened. So you have a peace treaty with an Arab state until 1994. See, but once this happens, the Israeli attitude under Begin, who's the prime minister, and who's committed to this total thing about keeping Judea and Samaria, the idea was, and this was the slogan, the Sinai has been lost, but Eretz Israel has been won, meaning Eretz Israel, the integral ancient Israel, including the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. We're going to keep this forever, no matter what people think. Forget Security Council Resolution 242, forget the whole thing. And this begins to lead then, after 1978, particularly in 79, the peace treaty, to this enormous settlement process that begins to go in the West Bank. Under Likud supervision, particularly Ariel Sharon. And the intensity of this, and it's very carefully planned, and you deliberately put settlements up against Palestinian Arab communities and take their land by saying it doesn't belong to them, etc. And the Reagan administration is very pro-Israeli because of the Cold War and things of this sort. And with respect to what's going on in Nicaragua, you know, and the Sandinistas, and we're pushing these Contras who are committing terrorist acts to killing civilians. Not only are the Israelis involved in this, but the Saudis are involved in this in terms of funding it. Saudis are funding this, and they're funding the Afghanistan Mujahideen as well, with our advice in Afghanistan. See, this is an anti-communist crusade in Afghanistan and in Central America, and the Iran-Contra thing where you're selling missiles to the Iranians, and the money will then go to fund, some of it will go to fund this as well in Central America. This is all part of the deal at that time. And a lot of these people who were convicted of lying and of crimes, who were then pardoned by the first President Bush, are in this Bush administration right now. Now, once you get this going on, what is going to happen? The Palestinians are increasingly coming under stress, and many more people, and this is ultimately going to lead to the first Intifada. And you're getting many more settlers coming in, militant settlers. Now, the Israelis are also pushing this, nice homes, low mortgages. You know, you can commute to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv in half an hour. You get all these new roads being put in, bypass roads, etc. So you don't have to see any Palestinians. This goes on all through the 90s as well. But this does lead to the first Intifada, an uprising that is relatively weapons-free. Stones, yes, but very, very few weapons. Totally in contrast to, and the Israelis more or less observed the rules. In other words, when they used these rubber-coated bullets they shoot at the legs. They don't shoot at the heads. They don't file down the rubber-coated bullets as they do in 2001, in the second Intifada. So, and the Intifada really resurrects Arafat, you see, but it also enables Hamas and groups like this, who the Israelis are encouraged to grow as Islamic groups against nationalist groups to divert attention from Arafat. That was a pretty dumb thing. Now they're all united together. Ultimately, the Israelis crush the Intifada in 1990-91, but thanks to Saddam Hussein, with whom we've been very close during the 80s, he invades Kuwait, and we decided to create a coalition to drive him out, First Gulf War. We want an Arab coalition because we don't want to just go in on Saudi territory, the sacred Islamic territory, where Mecca and Medina are. So we get Egypt and Syria to go along. And what do they say? Okay, we'll do it, but you've got to resurrect the Palestinian track here. You see, the Intifada has been crushed, many more settlements going in. You've got to do something. And the Bush administration, James Baker, the Secretary of State, agreed. So after you have, the first Iraq war, drive them out of Kuwait, the Iraqis out of Kuwait, then you have the Madrid conferences and exchanges that go on here, 91 to 93. They don't really lead anywhere. But in the territories, which are the occupied territories, you're beginning to get much more resistance now by Hamas, because Arafat, who has supported Saddam, has been shown to be a dupe, you see, and he's lost all his funding from the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, who have been giving him most of the money, and he supports Saddam Hussein, who then attacks him. So that's great logic. So he doesn't seem to be doing anything to oppose further Israeli settlements. Hamas is, and they're gaining more support. Once the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, essentially forces an election and opposes Yitzhak Shamir, the Israeli prime minister, who is resisting negotiations, they support Rabin coming in as prime minister. And Rabin and Peres finally decide to resurrect Arafat. Because if they can resurrect Arafat as the Palestinian leader, then maybe this will mute Hamas's appeal to Palestinians, and you'll have less resistance. See? That's how the whole Oslo process gets going. And you ultimately have the Oslo Accords in 93, and then you have the second one of 95, which is going to lead to Rabin's assassination by this Israeli terrorist. Now, let me summarize very briefly what happened with the Oslo Accords. First of all, Arafat and the Palestinians recognized the right of Israel to exist. Rabin and Israel did not recognize any Palestinian state. That never came about until 2001, 2002. What they did was recognize that the PLO was the spokesman of the organization of the Palestinians. But technically they could stop talking to them at any time, while in fact the Palestinians, represented by Arafat, had recognized Israel's right to exist. And many Palestinians were infuriated by this, not because they didn't want a two-state solution, they did, but simply because you'd given the farm away in terms of recognition and you hadn't got very much back. The Israelis controlled all the cards. And so this leads to a situation where from 93 and then even after Oslo II and 95, from 1993 down to the 2000 negotiations and the Intifada that breaks out, settlements double in the territories, particularly in the West Bank, during this peace process. See? So we can do what we want, but the Palestinians cannot resist. If they resist, this is terrorism, but we have a right to establish as many settlements as we want. And so you get the even greater takeover of land for bypass roads, immense roads, new settlements, et cetera, et cetera. With Arafat apparently acquiescing in this as part of the peace process. And what is the peace process getting you from the Palestinian point of view? Not very much. But ultimately, after the disastrous Netanyahu prime ministership, Ehud Barak comes in 1999 as prime minister. And he's a liberal, he's a labor person, he's a military hero, he's dynamic. At one point he says, in response to a question, if I'd grown up Palestinian of my generation, I probably would have been a terrorist. Well, should they do? Look at what has happened to them, you see? But Israeli politics was so fragmented by this time that when he created his coalition, he had to introduce parties that totally opposed any peace with the Palestinians. And the National Religious Party, he gave the housing ministry to them. So in Barak's prime ministership, before the Camp David talks in July of 2000, settlements increased at a more rapid rate under Barak than they had under Netanyahu. See what I mean? And all the time, Clinton is trying to create a negotiating mode, you know, for talks, which are ultimately going to be a disaster. But Barak backed off. Barak didn't really make offers. He never put anything in writing. He refused to talk to Arafat during the meeting. He always had Clinton make the offers. And if he didn't like what Clinton did, he could say, I don't agree with that. You see, but saying, I want further changes. So if Arafat said, well, I'll get back to you, but right now it doesn't look very good, the Palestinians, and there was this constant propaganda machine coming out about how the Palestinians were rejectionists, but this does not mean that the Israelis were that forthcoming at all. Now, in the end, with Clinton, you did have major breakthroughs. There were offers that were made that were very attractive. And Barak did go much further, certainly, than anything that had been done before. But he initially offered 66% of the land, with the Israelis to keep, 10% and another 14% for 20 years or more. Now, and this was a non-starter. Ultimately, through Clinton, not through Barak, you do get agreements on Jerusalem and a division up into Jewish and Arab sectors of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in Israel, Sharon is mobilizing support against all of this, to undermine it. And keep in mind that Sharon and Netanyahu had talked at demonstrations against Rabin in the summer of '95, where you had posters that called for Rabin's assassination. He had swastika, he was in the scope of a sniper, etc. Now, they say they never called for this. It's true they didn't, but they certainly were at major demonstrations where this stuff took place. Sharon is trying in Israel to totally undermine any of the talks that are going on. On that issue, there was really no agreement.